respect unto that. Do you know when Adam and Eve sinned and they were hiding in the garden, remember God clothed them. How did God clothe them? With animal skins, right? Sacrifice. You have sin, and then you had a sacrifice that God used, and it covered them. And it was just a covering. It didn't take away sin. It just was a covering. And so bloodshed was the sacrifice. You know, in the Old Testament it says, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. You know, the shedding of blood, there's a price that has to be paid for sin. That's just the way that it is. God will not overlook the guilty. He just won't put a blind eye to it. He calls sin what it is, right? Have you ever talked to somebody and maybe you're a little hesitant to use that word sin? Use it. It's Bible. Sin, transgression, that's what it is. Oh, he's got a lot of character faults. Sin. He's got anger issues. Oh yeah, I know that. That's called sin. Yeah, it's missing the mark. God doesn't mind calling it what it is, but God will show mercy. God will show mercy to the thousands that call upon His name. God will show grace and mercy, right? And so here, two offerers coming, and one brings blood, sacrifice. And God had respect unto that. So an offering is a type of worship, isn't it? They're bringing worship to God. Remember when, and Mike mentioned this on Wednesday about Abraham. Abraham said to his servants that were with him, Isaac and I are going to go up into the mountain to worship. Right? To worship. And now Cain, what was wrong with Cain's? Think about it. Why was Cain? I mean, Cain was a worshiper, right? I mean, he was the outward appearance anyway. He was coming to bring worship. But he brought something that was not acceptable to God. Right? It was the fruit. It was the bounty of the earth. But Abel brought the life. The life is in the blood. Now, when I look at that, when I read something like that, you know, I think of Calvary. That's, you know, we have the light of the New Testament. God was showing that sin is horrible. It's so horrible and so against His nature that a sacrifice of blood has to be made. Somebody has to pay. You know, when you break something, because I tell my boys, you know, sin always has a consequence. It always has a consequence. When you break something, somebody's got to replace it, right? There's a sacrifice on somebody's part. So here was an animal. The animal. You know, it's like the pig and the chicken. You know, you maybe have heard that before. The sign says ham and eggs special. And they're both laughing, you know, about it. But the pig's not. Because he says to the chicken, yeah, for you it's an offering. But for me it's a real sacrifice. So, that was a joke. Get it? The pig had to die. And so, anyways, let me write down not to say that one again. Thought that would maybe get the point across a little bit. Anyway, the shedding of blood. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. So he's giving them a reminder. And again, as you know, they had the sacrificial system where thousands and thousands of animals were killed. You know, when Solomon dedicated the temple, thousands of animals were killed on that day. Can you imagine the amount of blood? Can you imagine the smell? And God says that when these sacrifices come up, it's like a sweet savor. Now, boy, I mean, wow, God, how can that be a sweet Savior? Because the price was paid. Right? We could just overlook sin, which we often do. I'm just going to overlook sin. I'm not going to deal with it. But God doesn't do it that way. And so here Abel is showing, he's showing the right sacrifice that was to be to God. Now, let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. Chapter 11, he says, verse 4, By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. So here Paul is saying it was more excellent. God received Abel's sacrifice. And Paul says it was an excellent sacrifice. It was the sacrifice that God wanted. It was the type of worship that was the acceptable one. And you know, any acceptable worship that we give to God comes through Calvary. You know, with Abraham and Isaac, Abraham was about to kill his only son. The son of promise, excuse me. The son of promise. And the Lord stopped him. And God says, now I know. Now I know that your heart is for me. Now I know. And then remember, there was a ram caught in the thicket over there. And that was the sacrifice. What a picture, right? Picture of Calvary. Of how we are the one under the blade, right? We are the one to pay the price. And yet Jesus lays down his life. Jesus went to the cross and became the sacrifice. And he says, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. You know, that word gifts there is plural. That leads me to believe that this was something that was going on. This was something that was occurring regularly, possibly, right? But Cain, he came and he didn't bring the acceptable sacrifice. The acceptable worship was not there in Cain's life. You know, and if you think about it, Cain is really, you see the beginnings of, it's the beginnings of idolatry, false worship. Right? False religion. Because it's a system that's based on, I'm not going to give God what God requires. I'm going to do it another way. Because you can kind of read it and say, oh, poor Cain. You know, he brought a couple apples and a banana. I mean, what's the problem? But you see, rebellion was in Cain's heart. In Jude, you know, Cain gets another mention in the New Testament. In Jude, he says, woe unto them. He's speaking about false teachers that are coming and that are here. He says, woe unto them. He says, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and followed greedily after the heir of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Kor. I mean, Cain made it, not in the hall of faith, but in the hall of unbelief, in the hall of self-will. You see, that's what's in the heart of man. I don't want to give God what he deserves. I want to give God what I want to give God. You know, it's all about who are you going to worship. Look, hold your place there and look over in Romans chapter 1.